Welcome. Before we dive into this incredible true story, tell me where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe because a lot of work went into uncovering every detail of how Bumpy Johnson managed to reclaim Harlem in record time. This isn't just a story of power, it's a story of strategy, fear, and respect that reshaped the streets of Harlem in just 6 days. When Bumpy Johnson walked out of prison in 1963, Harlem wasn't the same neighborhood he had left behind. 6 years behind bars had done more than just keep him confined. It had allowed a new generation of gangsters, hustlers, and corrupt operators to stake their claims on the streets he once controlled. The blocks he had once walked with confidence were now crowded with rival figures, testing their luck, trying to fill the power vacuum left by his imprisonment. Drug corners changed hands, gambling dens flourished without oversight, and the sense of order that Bumpy had always imposed was all but gone. Harlem, at that moment, was a city on edge. Local businesses paid protection money to whomever seemed the strongest, and community elders whispered in fear about the escalating violence. The police, already stretched thin, were struggling to maintain any semblance of control, and politicians were more concerned with appearances than real enforcement. The streets were chaotic but bumpy. Even from the outside, understood that chaos was a tool as much as a problem. It created opportunities for someone clever, fearless, and respected to step back in and claim the crown that had once been his. As he walked toward the familiar blocks he had known since his youth, Bumpy's eyes were already calculating. He could see which corners had shifted, which dealers had grown bold, and which figures were vulnerable. Harlem hadn't just changed physically, the allegiances had shifted too. People who had once answered to him no longer recognized his authority, while others, who had been quietly loyal, were waiting for a signal, unsure whether their loyalty could withstand the new order. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew Bumpy Johnson's reputation, they knew what he was capable of, and they feared both his strategy and his temper. But the real question lingering in the air was whether Bumpy still had the influence to take it all back. 6 years could weaken a man, the streets could grow accustomed to new rules, and rivals might think him irrelevant. Yet the truth was that Bumpy had always been more than just muscle. He was a master of Harlem's social ecosystem. Every handshake, every nod, every whispered deal in the neighborhood had left its mark. Even behind bars, his reputation had not faded. People spoke of him in whispers, careful to avoid disrespect, because everyone knew that the moment he stepped out, things would change. The day of his release, the atmosphere in Harlem was electric. Loyalists and curious onlookers alike tried to catch a glimpse of him, some hoping to show allegiance, others simply wanting to witness the man who could still command fear and respect in equal measure. Bumpy didn't announce himself with fanfare or loud displays of wealth. He walked with a quiet authority that spoke volumes. Every step was deliberate, every glance calculated. People noticed. The way he moved suggested he hadn't just returned to the streets. He was already planning to take them back. But the state of Harlem made one thing clear. Reclaiming control wouldn't be easy. The power vacuum had allowed chaos to take root, and anyone attempting to assert dominance risked violent pushback. Rival gangs weren't going to step aside simply because Bumpy had been released. Every corner he passed, every block he crossed, was a test of respect. People were watching, waiting to see if he was the same man who had once ruled Harlem with both fear and loyalty. And Bumpy, aware of every eye, every whisper, moved with patience. He knew that the streets had changed, but the rules of power, he believed, hadn't. Loyalty, fear, and strategy, those were constants. In those first hours after leaving prison, Bumpy Johnson wasn't rushing. He was surveying. He was studying who had risen while he was away, mapping the terrain, identifying weaknesses. His reputation preceded him, but he understood that respect had to be earned in real time. The city he returned to was fractured, uncertain, and dangerous, but it was also a city ripe for someone with vision, courage, and the kind of intelligence that could turn fear into loyalty. Bumpy Johnson had always thrived in Harlem, and as he stepped back onto the streets, he could feel the shift beginning. The neighborhood, though chaotic, was waiting for its rightful leader to remind everyone who really ran the city. When Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem in 1963, the streets were a battlefield of opportunity and chaos. 6 years behind bars had left a vacuum that rival gangs and corrupt figures had rushed to fill, each carving out a piece of the neighborhood as if it were theirs by right. The old order, which Bumpy had maintained with a combination of fear, respect, and strategic alliances, had crumbled. There were dealers who thought they could run corners without consequence, pimps who tried to expand territories, and petty hustlers emboldened by the absence of a central authority. Harlem was fractured, divided among competing factions that barely tolerated each other and often clashed violently. The power vacuum didn't just create chaos, it invited aggression. In every block and alley, someone was trying to prove themselves. The small time crews who once reported to Bumpy had grown independent, forming alliances with outsiders who had no respect for the old hierarchy. Corrupt figures, from crooked cops to opportunistic politicians, saw the absence of a strong leader as a chance to tighten their control over Harlem's underground economy. Protection rackets had multiplied, gambling dens were flourishing without oversight, drug corners shifted ownership daily. The streets were like a storm without a center, dangerous, unpredictable, and incredibly lucrative for anyone daring enough to seize control. Bumpy understood that the vacuum wasn't just a challenge. It was an opportunity. These rival gangs, while bold, were disorganized. They had claimed territory without fully consolidating power. Alliances were fragile, built on fear rather than loyalty. There were rivalries simmering beneath the surface, grudges unspoken, and weaknesses waiting to be exploited. Every gang leader thought he was untouchable, but Bumpy had a history of understanding not just who controlled the streets, but how they thought, how they reacted under pressure, and how fear could be used as a weapon without unnecessary bloodshed. The corrupted figures in Harlem, too, had overstepped their bounds. Police officers who had once quietly tolerated Bumpy's presence had started extorting other crews in his absence. Politicians and businessmen who had once relied on his influence were now vulnerable, their profits threatened by the increasing violence on the streets. Even those who believed they were untouchable had underestimated the weight of Bumpy Johnson's name. Harlem had always respected him, and reputation alone could make people hesitate, even in a chaotic power vacuum. Bumpy's first challenge wasn't to fight every gang or take every corner. It was to assess the situation, identify which leaders could be negotiated with, and which would have to be confronted head-on. He walked through the streets he had known since childhood, observing who had risen in his absence and how the neighborhood had changed. Some blocks were controlled by men who had no real strategy. They ruled through intimidation, but their alliances were shallow and unstable. Others had stronger networks tied to outside crews or local politicians. These were the dangerous ones, the figures who could resist him if he acted too hastily. Even more than the gangs themselves, it was the uncertainty among the people of Harlem that defined the vacuum. Business owners, street vendors, and community elders all felt the tension. They were caught between fear of the new powers and respect for the old one. Bumpy could sense it. People were watching, waiting to see if he had returned with the same authority that had once kept the peace and maintained order. The power vacuum had created chaos, but it had also created a need for leadership. And Harlem, despite the violence and instability, had a memory of Bumpy Johnson as the man who could restore balance to the streets. By the time he had completed his first day back in Harlem, Bumpy had already begun to understand the landscape. He knew which gangs were overconfident and likely to make mistakes, which corners could be reclaimed with minimal confrontation, and which individuals could be won over through loyalty rather than fear. The vacuum was still there, it hadn't disappeared, but now he knew where to strike first. Every figure who thought they could rule unchecked was about to discover that absence doesn't last forever, and that a single man, armed with strategy, reputation, and fear, could reclaim an entire neighborhood in record time. The chaos created by the power vacuum was dangerous, yes, but for Bumpy, it was the perfect storm. It meant that the players on the board were exposed, that weaknesses could be exploited, and that the streets were ready for someone who knew not only the value of strength, but the subtle art of influence. While rival gangs scrambled for dominance, they had no idea that the man they had underestimated, the one they thought irrelevant, was already steps ahead, planning every move that would allow him to reclaim Harlem in just 6 days. Once Bumpy Johnson had assessed the chaos in Harlem, he knew that brute force alone wouldn't reclaim the streets. 6 years in prison had taught him patience, strategy, and the value of influence. He didn't need to confront every gang member or challenge every corner immediately. He needed alliances, smart, calculated partnerships that would allow him to rebuild power without unnecessary bloodshed. From the moment he stepped back into the neighborhood, Bumpy began quietly reaching out to those who still respected him. those who remembered his rule and understood that loyalty to him meant survival. The first alliances were subtle. He visited old contacts, small-time dealers, former lieutenants, and neighborhood figures who had kept the memory of his authority alive. He didn't make grand proclamations. Instead, he reminded them of his reputation and demonstrated that he had returned with clarity of purpose. For those who had drifted toward other factions, Bumpy offered protection, shared resources, and the promise of stability. Loyalty, he knew, was built as much on respect as it was on fear, and he understood that people followed leaders who could provide both. Bumpy also understood the importance of neutralizing potential threats through negotiation rather than confrontation. Some rival gang leaders were too embedded to be taken down immediately, so he approached them indirectly, sending word that resistance would be dangerous, but that collaboration could be profitable. He used his knowledge of each gang structure to identify the weak links, the men who were ambitious but insecure, the lieutenants who had been passed over for leadership, and those who feared the chaos around them. By offering them small advantages, he slowly began to pull them into his orbit, making it clear that his return wasn't a threat, but an opportunity, as long as they respected him. At the same time, Bumpy didn't neglect his shows of strength. He understood that Harlem streets were a theater of power, where perception was just as important as action. On the second day after his release, he made an appearance at key street corners, walking through areas controlled by smaller crews. His presence alone sent a clear message: the old order was returning. There were no large-scale confrontations yet, no violence, but everyone watching could sense the shift. Those who had grown bold in his absence suddenly hesitated, unsure whether to make a move against him or retreat. Even the most aggressive hustlers paused, because reputation can move faster than bullets. Strategically, Bumpy also leveraged the community itself. He reached out to local business owners, restaurateurs, and barbers, people who had long relied on his protection in the past. By reassuring them that stability was returning and that their interests would be safeguarded, he reestablished a network of support that extended beyond the streets. In Harlem, power wasn't just about muscle. It was about influence, respect, and the perception that one could maintain order when others could not. Bumpy had always understood that balance, and now he was using it to consolidate his return. He also used intelligence as a weapon. Bumpy had spent years behind bars observing human behavior, forming strategies, and learning who could be trusted. Upon returning, he gathered information quickly: who controlled which corners, where the loyalties lay, and which factions were likely to resist or collapse. By the third day, he had a clear map of Harlem's underworld, and with that knowledge, he could make targeted moves rather than acting blindly. Every alliance, every conversation, and every handshake was calculated to increase his influence while reducing unnecessary risk. One of the most notable aspects of his early strategy was his ability to blend diplomacy with intimidation. He made it clear that cooperation was the safer path, but he didn't shy away from sending subtle warnings to those who might challenge him. A single well-placed show of force, a confrontation with a minor gang member, or the quiet removal of a disruptive figure, reminded everyone that while he preferred loyalty over violence, he would not hesitate to use both if necessary. This balance of respect and fear allowed him to expand his network quickly, even before he directly confronted the most powerful rivals. Bumpy also understood timing. Every alliance, every move, was designed to maximize effect within the critical first days of his return. The longer a vacuum existed, the more entrenched the rivals became. By acting decisively in these initial hours, he ensured that momentum was on his side. Those who hesitated were often swept up in his strategy anyway, either by fear, by the promise of protection, or by the inevitability of his rising influence. By the end of the third day, the results of these strategic moves were already apparent. Key allies had reaffirmed loyalty. Weaker gangs were hesitant to challenge him, and the community itself began to sense that order was returning. The groundwork for a complete takeover of Harlem had been laid, and it was clear to anyone paying attention that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just back. He was ready to reclaim the streets, and he had the alliances and influence to do it efficiently and effectively. In Harlem, power was never simply given. It had to be earned, calculated, and sometimes imposed. And by using a combination of strategy, alliances, intelligence, and reputation, Bumpy Johnson had already positioned himself to reclaim control of the entire neighborhood, all while keeping the chaos of the streets under careful observation. The chessboard was set, and he had already moved the first pieces. By the fourth day after his release, Bumpy Johnson had done the groundwork. He had rebuilt alliances, assessed the rival factions, and reminded everyone in Harlem that he still commanded respect. But groundwork alone wasn't enough. Respect had to be reinforced with action, and authority had to be seen, felt, and feared. Bumpy knew that a few decisive moves, carefully calculated, could send a message that he wasn't just back, he was in full control, and any attempt to challenge him would have consequences. The first major confrontation came quietly, but with undeniable impact. A small-time gang, emboldened in his absence, had taken over a corner that Bumpy's former lieutenants considered part of his territory. Instead of attacking immediately, Bumpy sent a trusted ally with a message: the corner belonged to him, and if anyone resisted, it would cost them more than they could imagine. When word reached the gang, they laughed, thinking he was bluffing. But Bumpy wasn't bluffing. Later that night, he appeared himself, not with a gun blazing, but walking down the block with the calm authority of a man who had already won. His presence alone caused the gang members to freeze. Bumpy's method was simple yet terrifying. He confronted the leaders of the gang face to face, surrounded by his loyal lieutenants, and spoke in measured tones. He reminded them who had once kept Harlem safe and in order, making it clear that their actions in his absence had consequences. But he didn't strike recklessly. Instead, he combined intimidation with strategy. He allowed the leaders to save face if they surrendered their claim, and he ensured that they understood they could join his network rather than be destroyed. The result: the corner returned to Bumpy's control without a single bullet fired. It was a clear example of how influence, timing, and fear could be more powerful than raw violence. Not all confrontations were so simple. Rival factions that had grown powerful in his absence tested him directly. One prominent gang attempted to challenge Bumpy's authority by encroaching on multiple corners simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm his reinforcements. Bumpy, however, had already mapped out their weaknesses during his initial days back in Harlem. He confronted them in a controlled setting, isolating the leaders from their men. A tense standoff ensued, with both sides fully armed, the air thick with anticipation. But Bumpy's calm demeanor and sharp reputation did half the work. By the time words were exchanged, the rival leaders realized that Bumpy's control wasn't just a legend, it was immediate, precise, and unavoidable. Their crew dispersed quietly that night, leaving the territory to him. Another key show of strength came in the form of public presence. Harlem streets were alive with gossip, and Bumpy knew the importance of appearances. He made calculated walks through the neighborhood, stopping at strategic corners, greeting former allies, and subtly reminding everyone who had authority. People watched as he moved with purpose, unarmed yet unmistakably commanding. Each nod, each handshake, each quiet word reinforced the idea that Bumpy Johnson wasn't a man to be challenged lightly. These walks weren't just symbolic, they were psychological warfare, letting rival gangs know that he was observing them and that any misstep would be costly. In addition to direct confrontations, Bumpy used controlled acts of enforcement to send messages. Small demonstrations of power, like reclaiming a stolen shipment of goods from a rival gang or quickly resolving a dispute between street hustlers, showcased his ability to act decisively and efficiently. Harlem watched these events unfold, and with each demonstration, whispers spread, Bumpy's back and he's not playing. The combination of intelligence, timing, and visibility made his presence unavoidable. People didn't have to see him in every corner. They just had to hear about what he did, and the fear and respect followed naturally. By the fifth day, even the most audacious rivals understood that Bumpy's return wasn't a temporary disruption, it was a full reclamation. Gang members who had once ignored or mocked him now approached with deference, eager to negotiate rather than fight. Community members who had feared chaos began to feel a cautious sense of stability, recognizing that Bumpy's authority meant order would return. And throughout all this, Bumpy maintained the balance between fear and respect, the key to controlling Harlem without descending into unnecessary bloodshed. The strategic confrontations and public displays of authority weren't just about reclaiming territory. They were about sending a clear, undeniable message. Bumpy Johnson had returned, and he would not tolerate disobedience. By the end of day 5, he had solidified alliances, neutralized threats, and demonstrated that his reputation was backed by action. The streets, once fractured and chaotic, now subtly aligned under his authority. By the 6th day, Bumpy's power was effectively restored. Rival gangs had either been absorbed, intimidated, or neutralized, and the community recognized that he had returned not just as a survivor, but as the undisputed leader of Harlem. What took years for others to understand, he had accomplished in less than a week, a combination of strategy, intelligence, reputation, and carefully executed confrontations that left no doubt about who ran the streets. The 6 days that Bumpy Johnson spent reclaiming Harlem weren't just a short-term triumph. They reshaped the entire underworld of the neighborhood for years to come. His return didn't just put him back in control of corners, crews, and illicit businesses. It established a new order, one that combined fear, respect, and strategic alliances into a system that rivaled gangs, corrupt officials, and even the community could understand and, for the most part, adhere to. The impact of his actions reverberated long after the initial confrontations, creating a blueprint for power that others would study and struggle to replicate for decades. The most immediate effect was the restoration of structure in a previously chaotic environment. Before Bumpy's return, Harlem had been fractured, divided among competing gangs with no clear lines of authority. Violence was common, alliances were unstable, and the streets were unpredictable. But after those 6 days, a pattern emerged. Rival gangs either submitted to his authority, joined his network, or were forced out. Bumpy didn't just eliminate competition arbitrarily, he set rules and boundaries that everyone had to respect. Drug corners, gambling operations, and protection rackets were now under his indirect oversight, meaning conflicts could be managed more efficiently, and the neighborhood regained a semblance of order. Bumpy's takeover also cemented his reputation as both a strategist and an enforcer. Stories of his intelligence, patience, and tactical precision spread quickly throughout Harlem and beyond. Word of how he had assessed rival factions, negotiated alliances, and demonstrated strength without unnecessary bloodshed became legend. Young gangsters who had seen the chaos before his return now realized that true power wasn't just about violence. It was about knowing when to act, when to negotiate, and when to let fear do the work. Bumpy's example became a reference point for every ambitious figure in the city. If you wanted to survive and thrive in Harlem's underworld, you had to understand the rules he had just rewritten. Another lasting impact was the consolidation of loyalty. By selectively rewarding allies and punishing dissenters, Bumpy created a network of individuals whose allegiance was both genuine and pragmatic. These weren't just followers who feared him. They were partners who understood that being on Bumpy's side brought protection, opportunity, and survival. This loyal network became the backbone of his control, ensuring that even when he was absent from certain areas of Harlem, his influence remained strong. People knew that defying him wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal, and loyalty became a currency more valuable than money on the streets. Bumpy's return also affected how law enforcement and politicians interacted with Harlem's underworld. Officers who had grown accustomed to corruption and disorganization now faced a new reality. A single, intelligent leader could enforce order and manage the neighborhood's illicit activities more efficiently than anyone else. Some corrupt cops recognized the benefit of aligning with him rather than resisting, while politicians who had ignored the area had to take note of his influence. Bumpy's authority extended beyond the streets. It reached into the systems that had previously profited from chaos, altering how power was perceived and negotiated in Harlem. The psychological impact on rival gangs cannot be overstated. Those who had grown bold during his absence now understood that Bumpy Johnson was more than just a man, he was an institution. The precision with which he executed his 6-day takeover created a lingering fear, a reminder that Harlem had a leader who could reclaim control faster than anyone could react. Many of those who survived the initial week chose to work under him, understanding that cooperation was safer than rebellion. For decades afterward, his reputation alone was enough to influence behavior, prevent conflict, and stabilize the underworld in ways that few could rival. Bumpy's strategy during those 6 days also became a lesson in long-term thinking. While others might have focused on short-term gains, seizing corners, taking territory, or exacting revenge, he considered the sustainability of his control. He built alliances that would endure, neutralized threats that could resurface, and reinforced his legitimacy through both action and perception. This long-term approach ensured that Harlem didn't merely return to its previous state. It evolved under a system that valued balance between loyalty, respect, and fear. The cultural impact was significant as well. Harlem residents, even those outside the criminal world, understood that Bumpy Johnson was a figure of authority and influence. His ability to enforce order while commanding respect blurred the lines between fear and admiration. He became a symbol of Harlem's resilience and complexity, showing that power in the neighborhood wasn't just about violence. It was about intelligence, strategy, and the ability to inspire loyalty. Stories of his 6-day reclamation spread far and wide, entering local legend, folklore, and eventually historical accounts of the era. Even after his immediate control of Harlem was established, the effects of those 6 days were felt in unexpected ways. Rival crews who once sought to challenge him learned to avoid direct confrontation, instead seeking negotiation or collaboration. Community members who had suffered under previous chaotic rule found a strange stability in his presence, and new generations of gangsters grew up knowing that Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a criminal. He was the standard by which leadership and power in Harlem were measured. Ultimately, the 6-day takeover wasn't just a story of reclaiming territory. It was a blueprint for authority in an unpredictable environment. Bumpy Johnson demonstrated that respect, fear, loyalty, strategy, and timing were the pillars of lasting control. The neighborhood, once fractured and volatile, found structure under his leadership, and the lessons from those 6 days reverberated for decades. He didn't just reclaim Harlem, he reshaped its underworld, set the rules, and left a legacy that would be remembered as one of the most efficient and calculated returns to power in the history of organized street leadership.